Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage John J. DeGioia, President of Georgetown University.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to Gaston Hall. I want to thank you for joining us this morning. I'd like to welcome the members of our community as well as the guests, all of the guests who are here with us in person and those of you participating virtually. This is a place where throughout our history we have convened conversations of importance to our community, to our nation, and to our world. And this is certainly the case this morning. We're honored to be joined by Kristalina Georgieva, the International Monetary Fund's 12th Managing Director and Chair of the Executive Board. She joins us this morning to offer her insights and engage in dialogue about our current global economic context. She'll be joined in conversation by the Dean of our School of Foreign Service, Joel Hellman. In her role as Managing Director of IMF, a post she has held since 2019, she has governed the fund through a challenging period in our global economy during which the impacts of the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, rising levels of debt, impacts of climate change, and mounting global tensions have all significantly weakened our global economy. Before taking on this role, she served as the CEO of the World Bank from 2017 to 2019. She has a long commitment to global leadership, joining the bank in 1993 as an environmental economist, serving in many senior positions, including as Director for Sustainable Development, before being appointed Vice President and Corporate Secretary in 2008. Upon her appointment as Managing Director, she stated, and I quote, "The immediate priority of the IMF is to help countries minimize the risk of crises and be ready to cope with downturns," close quote. And she emphasized their focus on their long-term work, quote, "to build stronger economies and to improve people's lives," close quote. We are honored to have this conversation here at Georgetown, where we're called to reflect on the contributions we can make as individuals and as an institution to our global community. This gathering is an opportunity for us to gain a deeper understanding of the financial challenges facing our global economy and how we can address these challenges, provide more stability, and advance policies that will promote greater shared prosperity around the world. We are honored to welcome Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva to our campus at an important moment for the IMF as they approach their annual meetings here in Washington. We're grateful for her presence and for the insights that she will share with our community. It is an honor to welcome to the podium Kristalina Georgieva.
Choya Saksa. Thank you very much, President DeGioia, Dean Hellman, faculty, students, for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. And all the very best wishes to the Hoyas here and around the world. We are in Gaston Hall, and I stand in front of you. Behind me is the painting of Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom, and a very good reference point for what I'm going to be talking to you about today. Our world economy is like ship in choppy waters. We need all the wisdom we can muster to steady the ship and navigate through what lies ahead. In less than 3 years, we lived through shock after shock after shock. First, COVID, then Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and climate disasters on all continents. These shocks have caused immense harm on people's lives. Their combined impact is driving a global surge in prices, especially on food and energy, causing a cost of living crisis. And dealing with them is made harder by geopolitical fragmentation. We are experiencing a fundamental shift in the world economy from one of relative predictability with the rules-based framework on international economic cooperation, very low interest rates, low inflation, to a world with more fragility, greater uncertainty, higher economic volatility, geopolitical confrontations, and more frequent and devastating natural disasters, a world in which any country can be thrown off course more easily and more often. So, what can we do to prevent this period of heightened fragility from becoming the new normal, from becoming the world you would be living in? First and foremost, we must stabilize the global economy, steady the ship, by addressing the most immediate challenges. And as we address the crisis of today, we must revitalize global cooperation and transform our economies so they can withstand the shocks to come in the future. And this is why at the IMF, we are calling for early and joint action to regroup and to rethink how can we adopt a more proactive, precautionary mindset than we had in the past, and more willingness to act now and act together. This will be the focus of our annual meetings when they start next week. You're very familiar for all the arrivals of ministers, delegations. This year, our discussions are so very important for the future we build. So let me start with the urgency to stabilize the economy, given the darkening economic outlook. Last October, we projected a strong recovery from the depths of the COVID crisis. We finished the year with 6.1% global growth, very respectable. And most economists, including we at the IMF, were predicting the recovery to continue, inflation to subside quickly, largely because we expected vaccines will help tame supply-side disruptions and allow the economies to rebound. But this is not what happened. Multiple shocks, among them a senseless war, changed the economic picture dramatically. Far from being transitory, as we thought, inflation is much more persistent. High energy and food prices, tighter financial conditions, lingering supply disruptions decelerate growth. All of the world's largest economies are now slowing down. The euro area is severely affected by the reduction of gas supplies from Russia. China suffers from pandemic-related disruptions and a deepening downturn of their real estate market. And while the US still has a fairly vibrant and strong labor market, momentum is slowing down. Why? Because inflation is reducing disposable income of people, and consumer demand as a result is falling down, and higher interest rates are a drag on investments. This, in turn, affects emerging markets and developing countries. They face reduced demand for their exports and tighter financial conditions for those of them with high level of dollar-denominated debt. This is pretty dramatic. So what is happening is we have downgraded 3 times since October last year our growth projections. Last time we brought 22 to 3.2% growth, and for 23 projections was 2.9%. We will see, we always come around the annual meetings with our World Economic Outlook, that we are further downgrading our growth projections for next year. And we will be flagging that the risks of recession are rising. Our estimate is that 1/3 of countries around the world, this is the 1/3 share of the world economy, would experience at least 2 consecutive quarters of contraction this year and next year. And even in countries where growth is positive, for hundreds and millions of people, it would feel like recession because inflation is eating into real incomes. Overall, we expect global output as a result of all this to shrink between now and 2026 by $4 trillion. To give you a sense what is $4 trillion, this is the size of the German economy. Gone. And unfortunately, I'm the natural optimist, but today I stand in front of you and I need to say, more likely to get worse than to get better. In other words, risks are, as we say at the fund, on the downside. Why? Because uncertainty is very high in the context of war and a pandemic that hasn't quite left the scene. And what we see, and this is very concerning, is that financial stability risks are growing. Rapid and disorderly repricing of assets, especially where there are underlying vulnerabilities, can play a dangerous role for financial stability. So this is the picture, darker than we would have loved it to be. What can be done? And this is what our meetings are to wrestle with. How can policymakers stabilize the economy? Let me outline 3 priorities, and they're really, really important, starting from stay the course to bring inflation down. We make a misstep, the cost can be very significant. Not tightening enough would cause inflation to become de-anchored and entrenched, so with us for a long time, and that would require interest rates to tighten even more to bring it down, and that would cause tremendous harm on people, but also on prospects for growth. On the other hand, if we tighten too much, too fast, and do so in synchronized manner, we can push many economies into prolonged recession. So far, we see a relatively good shift. Tightening is leading to taking somewhat the heat out of domestic demand, including in the housing markets. Of course, not good if you are on the market right now, but it means that we are slowing down the risk for the economy. But we are not there yet. Central banks have to continue to respond. In the current environment, as painful that may be, this is the right thing to do. Even if the economy slows down as a result. Not easy, not without pain, but less pain if we take a look into the future. Do the right thing now. Now, we have monetary policy tightening. what about fiscal policy? Our second priority is for fiscal policy to act responsibly, to protect the most vulnerable households and businesses. In other words, to act without fueling inflation, to be a source of stability for the most vulnerable parts of society. Now, we have a severe cost of living crisis in some countries, already very painful on low-income households. So there has to be a helping hand for them. But these measures need to be very well targeted. Don't provide subsidies to the rich. Don't go for blanket price controls that benefit the poor but also benefit the wealthy. And make sure that these measures are temporary, that you are not embedding them in the economies forever. Where high energy prices are likely to persist, governments could provide direct help to low and middle income families and minimize the use of price controls. Why? Because we have learned the hard way that price controls, not affordable, not very effective. And avoiding this indiscriminatory fiscal support is very important for successfully fighting inflation. Just to give you a very simple image, when the monetary policy is stepping on the brakes, fiscal policy should not step on the accelerator. Otherwise, we are for a very rough and dangerous ride. Our third priority is joint efforts to support emerging markets and developing economies. A stronger dollar, high borrowing cost, capital outflows, they cause a triple blow on emerging markets and developing economies. And what it means for them is probability of portfolio outflows going up. And we put now the risk of this happening over the next 3 quarters at 40%. That could cause a tremendous problem for countries with large external financing needs. Now, one thing we always recommend is to maintain exchange rate flexibility, but also countries can take a more proactive approach. They can take precautionary steps before a crisis emerges. We have provided a policy tool, it is called Integrated Policy Framework, to help countries calibrate the best possible policies, and then we have precautionary lending instruments so they can use them to cushion themselves against risks. And one thing that you probably have read and heard about a lot, the problem of debt. During COVID, what did governments do to help their people and their economies? They borrowed. Debt has gone up. Now we are in a situation in which for emerging markets, more than a quarter of them have either defaulted or have bonds that are trading in distress territory. And what is very difficult to accept is that the picture is much worse in low-income countries. Over 60% of low-income countries are at or near that distress. What does it mean? Well, when you have numbers growing, then the risk of a debt crisis grows as well. And if it is to happen, it would not only harm people in these countries, but it would harm global growth and global financial stability. So we have to reduce the risk of this debt crisis. 2 years ago, a platform was developed. It is called Common Framework for Debt Resolution, which brings all creditors around the table, both official and private sector creditors, to provide debt relief to countries that ask for it. 3 countries asked: Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia. It has taken a long time, but finally we have an agreement on Zambia. We need faster, more predictable functioning of the common framework. And it is very important that large creditors, bear their responsibility to act, like China and the private sector. It is not only the right thing to do for countries, it is in their interest to act early to prevent a debt crisis. So these are the immediate actions we have to take. Hopefully, you will see us coming out of the meetings strong on taking these actions. But that is not going to be enough for our future. We need transformational reforms, and we need to support our members in undertaking these reforms. This is the focus of our work. So let me give you an example. Public finance. We are well known for this being our bread and butter. Countries can use medium-term fiscal sustainability frameworks to define space to invest in long-term objectives, education, health, social protection, but also digitalization to open the doors for innovation and for cutting-edge digital government services that are more transparent and more efficient. And think how we can use smart policies that we have been using in countries already. We know how to do that. So we can enable a digital-ready workforce to help people, especially young people, enter the workforce and stay there. We are also very keen for financial inclusion to open the door for innovation and participation of those who bring the future naturally with them. By the way, we should remember that if there was one silver lining from the pandemic, it was the power of digitalization. How many of you had to study from home? Of course. How many of you worked from home? Well, it wasn't great fun. Obviously, it is much better to be together, but we didn't miss on doing our jobs and we didn't miss on studying because we were digitally enabled. Think of the people that are not. So yes, we have some ability to project a more resilient future, but let me be very clear. That can only happen if countries work together. We have to face to the chilling effects of fragmentation. We cannot afford the world to break apart. We need to step up our efforts and raise our voices. We need each other. And let me talk about some of the areas where we need each other. We cannot succeed working alone. First, food security. Breaks my heart that we are going backwards on hunger. Hunger is the world's greatest solvable problem, but instead of solving it, we are marching backwards. Today, 345 million people are acutely insecure. What does acutely mean? They are desperate. Mothers and fathers cannot feed their children. So the world has to unite around addressing food security. We at the IMF just created a new food shock window in our emergency financing so we can provide help to countries. We have identified $9 billion in balance of payment needs, and we want to be part of the solution to countries that face this problem. Another obvious area where we need each other is climate change. It is an existential threat to humanity. We can survive inflation, we can survive recession, we cannot survive unmitigated climate crisis. We simply cannot. We have COP27. Do you know what is COP27? I see people nodding. We have to use it to mobilize action. At the fund, we have done something really fantastic. We have created our first ever long-term financing instrument. It is called Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We already have $40 billion for it. 2 countries crossed the finish line, Barbados and Costa Rica, to be the first to benefit from it. What we want is to use it primarily to remove barriers for private investment, because we need capital on scale for countries to succeed. I apologize. And with our policy advice, the IMF is helping our members. Actually, I can help myself. How would our members believe me that we can help them if I cannot help myself to get water? We have done tremendous work in capacity development. Just imagine we have provided policy capacity development support to 174 countries since the pandemic started, in key areas like domestic revenue mobilization, debt sustainability, public investment management. And we, of course, are a financier. Since the pandemic, we have provided $258 billion to 93 countries. And since the Russia invasion, we have supported 16 countries with $90 billion. This comes on top of $650 billion SDR allocation we did last year. So the IMF is stepping up in a more shock-prone world. And I promise you, we will continue to do so. So let me conclude going back to Athena. Do you know that she is also the patroness of weaving? Do you know that? Well, she is. If we are to navigate our way through this period of historic fragility, we must weave a new economic and social fabric that is stronger and more resilient. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice, guys. But not before I tell you this. We look back. COVID hits. The world comes together. We have overcome the worst of the COVID crisis. How? Together. Working together, we can have a better future for absolutely everyone, everywhere on our planet. And with this, I thank you. And I apologize for my voice. I can tell you, guys, when we are close to annual meetings, all I have to do is meet people and talk. So I'm obviously doing a little bit, perhaps more than I should.
Take a moment to get the...
Yeah, to get myself together. Just to be clear, I don't have COVID. I tested myself last night, and I tested myself this morning.
Look, given your message, I'm not sure it's entirely inappropriate to have your breath taken away. Because in 20 years of listening to annual meetings, curtain raisers, which this is, and we're honored that you've done it here, that was as stark an assessment of where we are at the moment, the risks that we're facing, the uncertainty. The notion, as you say, a period of historic fragility, but also, even more concerning, that fragility can become the new normal. So it's a stark assessment. One laced with some hope for possibilities of cooperation, but a stark assessment. I'd like to start because this generation here has never lived in a world of rising poverty. They've lived in a world, in fact, probably one of the greatest periods of poverty reduction the world has ever known. They've lived in a world of stable prices, They don't remember high inflation of the early 80s. They've lived in a world of increasing global integration and all of the positive and negative impacts that may have brought. The World Bank just released in its opening the notion that in 2020 70 million people have passed into extreme poverty. You talked about the extraordinary risks of food insecurity. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the knock-on effects of a world in which a historic era of poverty reduction seems to be, if not ending, certainly diminishing in scope? And then we're facing with a new risk of food insecurity, of extreme poverty, and everything that entails.
Wait, this is the most dramatic turnaround I have seen in my kind of longish life up to now. I am a mature woman of 69. I lived through communism, and it was pretty terrible to live on the other side of the Iron Curtain. I lived through a very dramatic financial crisis in my country when hyperinflation wiped out my mother's savings within 48 hours, gone, everything she worked for. So it's not like I haven't seen dramatic moments. But then we had 3 decades of building prosperity everywhere. And poverty shrunk dramatically. Hunger went down dramatically. Since 2020, with COVID hitting, this trend has been reversed. What it means is 3 things. One, there would be desperation and not just harsh economic conditions, but loss of dignity that would affect hundreds of millions of people. A tragedy that the world can and must try to avoid. 2, there would be more movements of people, more migration, and some of these movements of people may cause quite a stir. And 3, we would see more insecurity. We already see it. Let me just give you 2 examples. We had 2 presidents, the president of Chad and the president of Haiti, killed. This didn't make news. No news. 2 presidents in 2 months gone. And now we have Azerbaijan attacking Armenia, Tajikistan attacking Kyrgyzstan. Doesn't make news, but it must, because erosion of security is easy to happen and very hard to reverse. So as much as I would have liked to not be so dramatic, it is a dramatic moment. How can we deal with it? We can only deal with it if we strive to build bridges so the world comes together. There is no other way. If we continue in sort of egotistic manner of, oh, well, I'm okay, my country's fine, sooner or later, your country is not going to be fine because spillovers will affect you. One thing I learned, I was for 5 years humanitarian and crisis commissioner. I had the front seat in the most dramatic humanitarian catastrophes in the world. And what I learned from this is trouble travels. It doesn't stay in one place. And if we want to live in a world that is a great place for us, for my daughter, for my grandchildren, we better wake up and work together.
Well, one of the things that's so worrying about the remarks that you made is at a moment in time where the needs are going to be so great, and especially to support the world's most vulnerable on things like food security, on reducing these poverty numbers. We're facing, as you described it, a potential period of debt crisis in which the low-income countries, of course, are going to be the most impacted. It's a remarkable number. 60% of low-income countries are facing debt distress. They were borrowing on the private sector markets. They were borrowing from China. They were borrowing from multilaterals. As you rightly pointed out, a lot of that money is going to dry up. People are going to run for the safety. Are the resources there at the very moment that they're so desperately needed to prevent some of the worst outcomes that you're talking about?
Yes. One thing that I should stress is that both the IMF and the multilateral development banks have financial capacity, and we are stepping up. The IMF has capacity to lend that is $1 trillion. You heard the numbers. We are under 300 billion of deployment of this capacity. So we have resources to come to the rescue of countries. And so do development banks. More importantly, there is now a growing recognition among the creditors that they need to act on preventing individual debt distress into turning into a debt crisis. I am encouraged by the engagement we had with both China and private sector on Zambia and on Chad. Of course, we still have to deliver the full debt restructuring in these countries. But the message is very simple. It is in your interest not to be in a place where everybody is defaulting on you. Act early. Maybe the most important message from my talking to you today is anticipate shocks. They will come. I don't know what the next shock is going to be. I only know there will be a next shock. Act early, and protect the most vulnerable. And that would add to stability for all.
Now, let's talk about one of the shocks that you mentioned. COVID, we seem to be trying to figure a way forward and living with a COVID regime. The horrific invasion, Russian invasion of Ukraine, which some thought would be over quickly, now looks like it's going to be an extended festering wound on the global economy, on the global polity, not to mention the horrific impacts it's having for the Ukrainian people. We're starting to see the impacts on energy markets. We saw the OPEC Plus decision. If this becomes a prolonged stalemate, how will that impact the risk that you're talking about? What do you see as the knock-on effects of such a prolonged stalemate?
Well, first, let me say that I am still shocked that this happened. My brother is married to a Ukrainian. He was in Ukraine. He was in Kharkiv at the time the war started. And the fact that there is yet again war on European soil, and yet again millions of people are leaving their country to run away from the war, this just breaks any human logic. Why? If I ask you here in this audience, how many of you think that this is a senseless war, a war that shouldn't exist? Raise your hand. Of course, of course. So if we could have a vote of the world's people, and it determines what the Russians do, this war would be over. But we are not in that world. So what is the most dramatic consequence? Of course, there are many risks, including a risk of spillover from Ukraine to other countries. But the most dramatic consequence really is breaking the world into blocks. One with Russia, one against Russia, and one that is sitting on the bench. What are the consequences of the world breaking into blocks? We all are going to be poorer in poor countries and in rich countries. Just to give you the numbers, because we have an integrated world economy, it has grown 3 times. It tripled over the last decades. Tripled. Who is the big beneficiary? Emerging markets and developing economies. They have quadrupled. But also advanced economies are winners. They doubled because we have that integrated world. So you take this away. What are the consequences? Dramatic for low-income countries, dramatic for the developing world. So we talk about poverty eradication, hunger, ain't gonna happen in a world that is broken into blocks. Just because we are going to lose a great deal of economic efficiency that has helped us to be richer. Yes, I want to be clear. We have learned from COVID, not just from the war. From COVID, we learned that there is value of diversification of supplies, that supply security matters. So we do have to revise our narrow concept of economic efficiency that used to be you only look at cost. Now you have to look at cost and you have to look at security of supplies, otherwise your economy can suffer. But if we go to a point when we cut off parts of the world from each other, it would be the poor in rich countries, and it would be the poor countries that would bear the brunt of the impact of it. So you have voice, use it. Use it to call for all of us to work together. And when you do it, you actually are acting in your own self-interest. So the world of tomorrow is a more prosperous world.
I'm going to ask you a last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to student questions and audience questions, so prepare. I'm glad it looks like a hot beverage that can help a little bit more. But look, you're calling for a new economic, social, weaving a new economic and social fabric, as you said in your remarks, at a time when we have, after 30 years of I wouldn't say necessarily a tightly woven social fabric, but one in which wasn't driving apart into blocks, as you say, this fragmentation that we're sort of seeing. What can the IMF do to foster that? Because we do have a set of international institutions that are designed to weave the world together. How, first of all, maybe you can say 2 parts of this question. One is, your shareholders are part of these disparate blocks. So how do you manage to put together a kind of integrated approach to solving these problems when some of your shareholders are increasing this great power competition? And then secondly, what do you see the role of the IMF in trying to sort of foster this kind of new engagement?
Great questions, and I'm very happy you're asking this. So the first thing we can do is very pragmatic, bring the countries together on what is in their common interest and get to an outcome of this coming together. This is why we work on food security. We think it is in everybody's interest. This is why, and our membership came together very quickly on this food shock window. On climate, our membership came very quickly together, one, to give us a mandate to act on climate change. We didn't have it before. And even today, there are people who would say, what is the IMF having to do with climate change? Well, a lot, because climate risks are macro-critical. Climate shocks undermine macroeconomic and financial stability. And on the flip side, investment in climate creates new opportunities, new jobs, impacts the economy. So our membership gave us a mandate, and we now have this Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which is kind of a small revolution at the fund, because traditionally the fund does not have long maturity instruments. But a transformation to a climate resilient and low carbon economy takes time. So we need this instrument, and now we have it. In other words, we focus on actionable items. We bring everybody together and we act. And I can tell you this is fantastic, because when people get something done together, there is joy from it. There is a positive spillover on relations among the members. And the second thing we do is, to be very frank, speak truth to power. And it is very important that in this era we have the IMF objectively analyzing where we are headed, what are the risks, how they can be overcome. I would say very often people associate the IMF with IMF programs in countries, and they're very important. And we see a very rapid increase in demand for programs in this challenging time. But where the IMF is most helpful to the world is our so-called surveillance. The fact that we are the institution that holds a hand on the pulse of the national economies and on the world economy. And we can objectively tell our members what do they do well, where the risks are. Are we always right? Of course not. But is our analysis objective? Our staff non-biased, even-handed? Yes, we are.
I'm going to ask people, if you have a question, to go to the mic. There's a mic right there. And while they're going, I just want to ask one follow-up to that, which is the scale of the support. Because what you're describing is a world of such significant large-scale problems that I wonder, do you think that you have the scale ability? For example, you mentioned the debt issue and the facility to sort of support that. 3 countries have managed to pass. Yep. You've already got a third of the countries in essentially junk or default status, and 60% of low income coming up. How are you going to handle the scale of the poverty reduction problems, of the debt problems, given the resources that you have?
Well, the most important thing is not what the fund finances, but how countries use their own capacity. And where I can tell you I'm very proud of my colleagues, where we are making a difference is when we help countries to have tax regime that generates revenues, and then they have public investment management. We help with that. That makes good use of money, that there is a transparency and accountability, that countries build social safety nets. One of the big lessons from COVID, or actually two lessons there correlated. One, if you have strong fundamentals and good buffers, when a shock hits you, you're more likely to do well. 2, when you have social safety nets in place to target vulnerable people, you can deploy them and then prevent tragedies on a multiple scale. So that is where the fund has been and continues to be a very important institution. Plus, we pride ourselves to be looking also into the future and not just doing what we have learned to do in the past, and help our members see through a very clouded situation of today.
Okay. Let's go to questions. Please give us your name and ask a brief question, please. 1.
My name is Fiona. I'm a first year in the SFS. And you emphasize the importance of protecting emerging economies through policy frameworks. So I was wondering, with the increase in borrowing and the growing risk of debt crisis, how can the IMF ensure that wealthy lending nations work with and not for developing nations?
The way we do it is twofold. One, data. Information is a very powerful thing. When you can present what is going on, when you can present that, we call it debt sustainability analysis. When you present the situation in a country, then you have a credible road to bring the creditors to look into solutions for these countries. And of course, we also provide financial support so countries can overcome the period of time when interest rates are high, Debt service can be suffocating, then the fund can ease the pressure on countries. Most important is our role to help countries really come through a difficult time with much stronger fundamentals, and they matter. They matter, and that I can tell you now we have a growing engagement with private sector creditors, with bilateral creditors, traditional and non-traditional, and what we want is to press forward with solutions on a country by country basis, but also in terms of what is the right approach to help countries.
Next question, please.
Thank you for your time today, Director. My name is Han Jun. I'm a first year at the SFS. You mentioned earlier of approximately $300 billion spent throughout to aid certain countries, but oftentimes these aren't free loans, and often the IMF has come under scrutiny for worsening economic crises by putting countries in more debt. In the modern context, how is the IMF using these funds to ensure that countries don't get caught up in this endless cycle of debt and instead actually result in actual practical growth?
Yeah, very good question. What we do with our programs is to try to minimize what we lend and maximize what we bring as a package of support from others. In particular, for low-income countries, grant support. I'll give you an example. We are currently discussing a program for Malawi. The country is in a very difficult situation. What we want to see is the World Bank coming up with grants, bilateral donors coming up primarily with grants, because Malawi cannot take up more debt. It is already debt is already not sustainable. We do lend. Why? Because by putting money on the table, we say to all these others, it is okay for you to come. This country is taking the right turn on policies. And I also would say something that often is ignored. What are we? We are a lender of last resort. In other words, countries cannot borrow from anybody else. They come to the fund. Well, when you're a lender of last resort, you're lending to a borrower in a very difficult situation. In other words, the risks are much higher than they would be for a country that can access private capital. And this is something that sometimes the public undervalues, that when we take more risk, of course it may not work. The political will may disappear. Our program may not be anchored well. But should we then say, oh, well, we stay out of it? No, our job is to be there, and as I said, to bring others to create this anchor of trust for the country.
Next question. I'm going to ask two, please, so if we can group those two questions.
Oh my goodness, it's a queue. I apologize. I didn't see that.
Hello, my name is Taiji Sasaki, and I'm a second-year MSF student. And I have a question regarding the ongoing crisis in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. So this summer we witnessed political unrest and debt crisis in Sri Lanka. And as soon as we saw it, we had a narrative of, oh, this is again debt trap by China, or this is the result of opaque lending by some countries. But if we see the figures, actually debt to China from Sri Lanka and debt to Japan was about the same level. So I am actually very skeptical about this narrative of opaque lending or debt trap, and I want to hear your view on this, on the issue of debt trap or opaque lending, because I think it's way too much politicized.
Yeah. So when we look at Sri Lanka, what is the fundamental problem? Sri Lanka did not have very sound policies. It borrowed more than it can serve, and inevitably that led to a crisis. The big lenders to Sri Lanka, China, India, Japan, they all have a responsibility to sit together and figure out how they can help the country. We have done our part, which is that sustainability analysis. We have a staff-level agreement with Sri Lanka. All we need now is the creditors to agree on how we can help the country to move forward. Look, debt per se is not a bad thing. If you borrow and you invest to increase the productive capacity of the economy, it pays back. And you serve your debt and you have a surplus. That is a bad thing when it goes into white elephant projects, also when it is not transparent, when there is corruption and people pay back something that others have stolen. And this is where I kind of slightly disagree with you. I think that in Sri Lanka there was a little bit too much of non-transparency around who do they borrow from, what for, how it is being served. And I hope that they would turn the page and that would never happen again in the future.
Well, in this last round of questions, I will ask for two. We'll just pile up two if you can,
yeah,
so we can get the next two questioners, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. My name is Sanjana. I'm a second-year undergrad. You talk a lot about how emerging markets are particularly vulnerable to the current economic shocks, but I also know that the IMF, among other international institutions, has been criticized for emerging markets maybe not having adequate representation or influence in the policies. So I'm wondering what you think about the credibility of those criticisms and whether you think remedifying that is a priority to make sure that this recovery is successful.
Yep.
And the next question, thank you.
Hi, my name is Vanessa, and I think my colleague already beat me to my question. And let me just rephrase it. So I was wondering, how do you see lifting some of the IMF's conditional loans to vulnerable countries as a way to help solve not only some of the social and humanitarian challenges that these vulnerable countries face, like food insecurity, but also as an global economic strategic approach to the economic crisis that we're facing, and that many more to come.
Thank you. Please.
So, we do have an important job to do in terms of voice and representation of emerging markets. Next year, we have to carry out our so-called 16th quarter review. This is to see what are the quota of different members, with the objective of shifting quotas from advanced economies to emerging market developing economies in response to the shifting share the emerging markets and developing economies have in the world economy. Is this going to completely bring a balance? No, this is a step. I hope a step in the right direction. But we also have other ways to increase voice and representation. And it is by making sure that we hire people who bring that voice into the fund. I'm very proud, I'm very proud to be the first managing director that comes from an emerging market economy, a country that lived through an IMF program. But I also have a team. We are 5. I have 4 deputies. And among my four deputies, Gita Gopinath, she is, as they call it, overseas Indian, super smart, US national, but born and raised in India. Antoinette Sayer from Liberia, Bo Lee from China, and Kenji Okamura from Japan. So this is also first. We have 3 women and 2 men at the top of the IMF. Never happened before. But also among our directors, we try to have that diversity of views so we can actually have the empathy and understanding for the countries we serve. And yes, please continue to raise your voice for the IMF to reform itself so we are more representative of the world we serve. On the question of conditionality, We have done something during COVID that is a very important lesson for us. We provided massive emergency financing, and we ask for only one thing: keep the receipts. I want to know what you spent your money for. It has to go for health, it has to go for social safety nets. And we also, at that time, mobilized the world to provide $650 billion special drawing rights. These are reserves that we create and we give to our members, no conditionality. But is conditionality bad? No. We have two types of situations. One, when a country, let me put it very bluntly, messes up. Like my country in the mid-90s, horrible policies, they led to a catastrophe of the economy. Should we have conditions when we lend to countries that messed up? Yeah, because we want them to get into a good shape, and we usually look at what they can improve so their people can have better opportunities. And the second case is when the country is doing well, but it is hit by exogenous shock, like COVID, like the war in Ukraine. And there, you're right, then we should be thinking of providing financing in a way that reflects the fact this is an innocent bystander that was hit by a crisis. And we are working with our board to think through, because maybe emergency financing is not the right way to go always. Maybe we have to think of how we update our instrument capacity. But I can tell you, we think about this all the time because we recognize the world is changing, the IMF also has to change.
Well, on a final note, because I know you've got to go, because you're preparing for 190 finance ministers to join for the annual meetings. But can I ask you you talked about the mindset shift, and this is a generation.
I'm sorry, people on the queue.
Sorry.
It looks like we will have to have another date.
Can I just ask you to just leave us with a message of what they should be doing in terms of what their role is in this mind shift, the next generation?
Okay. This I'm going to respond to by referring to my hero and your former professor, a fantastic woman, Madeleine Albright. Madeleine Albright said something that resonates with me. When you have the power to choose, you have the power to change. And you have the power to choose. You're not some bystanders on the big history plate. And then you have the power to change. And let me be very, very clear. I am optimistic about the future because I know you guys are not going to be passive for what is ahead of us. You would keep us on our toes. The generation I represent, we made all kinds of mistakes. Look at the climate situation. But we also made some good things. Preserve them. My country is democratic today. It wasn't. But choose wisely. Choose where you put your energy and change the world. So it is a better world, no poverty, no hunger.
Thank you very much. The challenge is certainly there. Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Don't touch me because I'm now,
If I could just ask you to hold on in your seats for a moment while we escort the Managing Director out, I appreciate it, and thank you all for coming this morning.
Thank you very much, guys. I want to hear you. 1, 2, 3. Hoya! That is great. Thank you.
We're going to head up this way.